Chapter 25 of The Protector by Harold Bindloss. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Melin. The Protector by Harold Bindloss. Chapter 25 The Intercepted Letter. The wind was fresh from the northwest when Vane drove the sloop out through the Narrows in the early dawn and saw a dim stretch of white-flecked sea in front of him. Landlocked as they are by Vancouver Island, the long roll of the Pacific cannot enter those waters. But they are now and then lashed into short, tumbling seas, sufficient to make their passage difficult for a craft no larger than the sloop. Carroll frowned when a comber struck the weather bow and a shower of stinging spray whipped his face. "Right ahead again," he remarked. "But as I suppose you're going on, we'd better stretch straight across on the starboard tack. We'll get smoother water along the island shore." They let her go, and Vane sat at the helm, hour after hour, drenched with spray, hammering her mercilessly into the frothy seas. They could have done with a second reef down, for the deck was swept and sluicing, and most of the time the lee rail was buried deep in rushing foam. But Vane showed no intention of shortening sail. Nor did Carroll, who saw that his comrade was disturbed in temper, suggest it. Resolute action had, he knew, a soothing effect on Vane. As a matter of fact, the latter needed soothing. Of late he had felt that he was making steady progress in Evelyn's favor, and now she had most unexplainably turned against him. But, rack his brain as he would, he could not discover the reason. That he was conscious of no offense only made the position more galling. In the meanwhile, the boat engrossed more and more of his attention. It was a relief to drive her hard at some white-topped sea and watch her bows disappear in it with a thud, while it somehow eased his mind to see the smashed-up brine fly half the height of her drenched mainsail. There was also satisfaction in feeling the strain on the tiller when, swayed down by a fiercer gust, she plunged through the combers with the froth swirling, perilously close to the coaming, along her half-submerged deck. The day was cold. The man, who was compelled to sit almost still in a nipping wind, was soon wet through, but this, in some curious way, further tended to restore his accustomed optimism and good humor. He had partly recovered both, when, as the sloop drove through the whiter turmoil whipped up by a vicious squall, there was a crash forward. "Down helm!" shouted Carroll. "The bobstay's gone!" He scrambled towards the bowsprit, which, having lost its principal support, swayed upward, in peril of being torn away by the sagging jib. Vane, who first rounded up the boat into the wind, followed him. And for several minutes they had a struggle with the madly flapping sail before they flung it, bundled up, into the well. Then they ran in the bowsprit, and Vane felt glad that, although the craft had been rigged in the usual Western fashion, he had changed that by giving her a couple of headsails in place of one. "She'll trim with the staysail if we haul another reef down," he said. It cost them some labor, but they were warmer afterwards, and when they went on again, Vane glanced at the bowsprit. "We'll try to get a bit of galvanized steel in Nanaimo," he said. "I can't risk another smash." "You had better be prepared for one, if you mean to drive her as you have been doing," Carroll flung back the saloon scuttle. "You'd have swamped her in another hour or two. The cabin floorings are all awash." "Then hadn't you better pump her out?" retorted Vane. "After that you can light the stove. It's beginning to dawn on me that it's a long while since I had anything to eat." By and by they made a bountiful, if somewhat primitive, meal, in turn sitting in the dripping saloon, which was partly filled with smoke, and Carroll sighed for the comforts he had abandoned. He did not, however, mention his regrets, because he did not expect his comrade's sympathy. The craft, being under reduced sail, drove along more easily during the rest of the afternoon, and they ran into a little colliery town on the following day. There, Vane replaced the broken bobstay with a solid piece of steel, and then sat down to write a letter, while Carroll stretched his cramped limbs ashore. The letter was addressed to Evelyn, and he found it difficult to express himself as he desired. The spoken word, as he had discovered, is now and then awkward to use, but the written one is more evasive still, and he shook his head ruefully over the production when he laid down his pen. This was, perhaps, unnecessary, for, having grown calm, he had framed a terse and forcible appeal to the girl's sense of justice, which would in all probability have had its effect on her had she received it. Though he hardly realized it, the few simple words were convincing. Having received no news from Nairn or Jessie, they sailed again in a day or two, bound for Comox, farther along the coast, where there was a possibility of communications overtaking them. But in the meanwhile, matters which concerned them were moving forward in Vancouver. It was rather early one afternoon when Jessie called upon a friend of hers and found her alone. Mrs. Bendel was a young and impulsive woman from one of the eastern cities, and she had not made many friends in Vancouver yet, though her husband, whom she had lately married, was a man of some importance there. "I'm glad to see you," she said, greeting Jessie eagerly. "It's a week since anybody has been in to talk to me, and Tom's away again." Jessie made herself comfortable in an easy-chair before she referred to one of her companion's remarks. "Where has Mr. Bendel gone now?" she asked. "Into the bush to look at a mine. He left this morning, and it'll be a week before he's back. Then he's going across the Selkirks with that Clavering man about some irrigation scheme." This suggested one or two questions which Jessie desired to ask, but she did not frame them immediately. "It must be dull for you," she said sympathetically. "I don't mean to complain," her companion informed her. "Tom's reasonable. The last time I said anything about being left alone, he bought me the pair of ponies." "You're fortunate in several ways. There are not a great many people who can make such presents. But while everybody knows how your husband has been successful lately, I'm a little surprised that he's able to go into Clavering's irrigation scheme. It's an expensive one, but I understand they intend to confine it to a few, which means that those interested will have to subscribe handsomely." "Tom," said her companion, "likes to have a number of different things in hand. He told me it was wiser when I said I couldn't tell my friends back east what he really is, because he seemed to be everything at once. But your brother's interested in a good many things too, isn't he?" "I believe so," answered Jessie. "Still, I'm pretty sure he couldn't afford to join Clavering and at the same time take up a big block of shares in Mr. Vane's mine." "But Tom isn't going to do the latter now." Jessie was almost startled. This was valuable information which she could scarcely have expected to obtain so easily. There was more she desired to ascertain, but she had no intention of making any obvious inquiries. "It's generally understood that Mr. Vane and your husband are on good terms," she said. "You know him, don't you?" "I've met him at one or two places, and I like him. But when I mention him, Tom smiles. He says it's unfortunate Mr. Vane can only see one thing at once, and that the one which lies right in front of his eyes. For all that, I've heard him own that the man is likable." "Then it's a pity he's unable to stand by him now." "I really believe Tom was half sorry he couldn't do so last night. He said something that suggested it. I don't understand much about these matters, but Howitson was here, talking business, until late." Jessie was satisfied. Her hostess's previous incautious admission had gone a long way, But to this was added the significant information that Bendel was inclined to be sorry for Vane. The fact that he and Howitson had decided on some joint action after a long private discussion implied that there was trouble in store for the absent man, unless he could be summoned to deal with the crisis in person. Jessie wondered if Nairn knew anything about the matter yet, and decided that she would try to sound him. In the meanwhile, she led her companion away from the subject, and they discussed millinery and such matters until she took her departure. It was early in the evening when she reached Nairn's house, which she had thought it better to arrive at a little before he came home, and was told that Mrs. Nairn and Miss Chisholm were out, but were expected back shortly. Evelyn had been by no means cordial to her since their last interview, and Mrs. Nairn's manner had been colder, but Jessie decided to wait, and for the second time that day fortune seemed to play into her hands. It was dark outside, but the entrance hall was brightly lighted, and she could see into it from where she sat. Highly trained domestics are generally scarce in the West, and the maid had left the door of the room open. By and by there was a knock at the outer door, and a young lad came in with some letters in his hand. He explained to the maid that he had been to the post office and had brought his employer's private mail. Then he withdrew, and the maid, who first laid the letters carelessly on a little table, also retired, banging a door behind her. The concussion shook down the letters, and several, fluttering forward with the sudden draught, fell near the threshold of the room. Jessie rose to replace them. When she reached the door, she stopped abruptly, for she recognized the writing on one envelope. There was no doubt it was from Vane, and she noticed that it was addressed to Miss Chisholm. Jessie picked it up, and when she had laid the others upon the table, stood with it in her hand. "Has the man no pride?" she said, half aloud. Then she looked about her, listening, greatly tempted, and considering. There was no sound in the house. Evelyn and Mrs. Nairn were out, and she was cut off from its other occupants by a closed door. Nobody would know that she had entered the hall, and if the letter were subsequently missed, it would be unlikely that any question regarding its disappearance would ever be asked. If there was no response from Evelyn, Vane, she thought, would not renew his appeal. Jessie had no doubt that the letter contained an appeal of some kind, which might lead to a reconciliation, and she knew that silence is often more potent than an outbreak of anger. She had only to destroy the letter, and the breach between these two people whom she desired to separate would widen automatically. There was little risk of detection, but standing tensely still, with set lips and her heart beating faster than usual, she shrank from the decisive action. She could still replace the letter, and look for other means of bringing about what she wished. She was self-willed and endowed with few troublesome principles, but until she had poisoned Evelyn's mind against Vane, she had never done anything flagrantly dishonorable. Then, while she waited, irresolute, a fresh temptation seized her in the shape of a burning desire to learn what the man had to say. He would reveal his feelings in the message, and she could judge the strength of her rival's influence over him. Yet she hesitated, with a half-instinctive recognition of the fact that the decision she must make was an eventful one. She had transgressed grievously in one recent interview with Evelyn, but while she had no idea of making reparation, she could, at least, stop short of a second offense. She had perhaps not gone too far yet, but if she ventured a little farther, she might be driven on against her will and become inextricably involved in an entanglement of dishonorable treachery. The issue hung in the balance, the slightest thing would have turned the scale, when she heard footsteps outside and the tinkle of a bell. Moving with a start, she slipped back into the room just before the maid opened the adjacent door. In another moment or two she thrust the envelope inside her dress and gathered her composure as Mrs. Nairn and Evelyn entered the hall. The former approached the table and turned over the handful of letters. "2 for you from England, Evelyn, and 1 or 2 for me," she said, and, as Jessie noticed, flashed a quick glance at her companion. "Nothing else," she added. "I had thought Vane would maybe send a bit note from one of the island ports to say how he was getting on." Then Jessie rose to greet her hostess. The question was decided. It was too late to replace the letter now. She could not remember what they talked about during the next half-hour, but she took her part until Nairn came in, and contrived to have a word with him before leaving. Mrs. Nairn had gone out to give some instructions about supper, and when Evelyn followed her, Jessie turned to Nairn. "Mr. Vane could be at Comox now," she said. "Have you any idea of recalling him? Of course I know a little about the Claremont affairs." Nairn glanced at her with thoughtful eyes. "I'm not acquainted with any reason that would render such a course necessary." Evelyn reappeared shortly after this, and on the whole Jessie was glad of it, but she excused herself from staying for the evening meal, and walked home thinking hard. It was needful that Vane should be recalled, and though he had written to Evelyn, she still meant to send him word. He would be grateful to her, and indignant and wounded as she was, she would not own herself beaten. She would warn the man, and afterwards perhaps allow Nairn to send him a second message. On reaching her brother's house, she went straight to her own room and tore open the envelope. The color receded from her face as she read, and sinking into a chair, she sat still with hands clenched. The message was terse, but it was stirringly candid, and even where the man did not fully reveal his feelings in his words, she could read between the lines. There was no doubt that he had given his heart unreservedly into her rival's keeping. For a while she sat still, and then, stooping swiftly, seized the letter, which she had dropped, and rent it into fragments. Her eyes had grown hard and cruel. Love of the only kind she was capable of had suddenly turned to hate. What was more, it was a hate that could be gratified. A little later Horsfield came in, and though she was very composed now, she noticed that he looked at her in an unusual manner once or twice during the meal that followed. "You make me feel you have something on your mind," she said at length. "That's a fact," Horsfield confessed. The man was attached to and rather proud of his sister. "Well?" Horsfield leaned forward confidentially. "See here," he said, "I've always imagined that you would go far, and I'm anxious to see you do so. I wouldn't like you to throw yourself away." His sister could take a hint, but there was information she desired, and the man was speaking with unusual reserve. "Oh," she said, with a slight show of impatience, "you must be plainer." "Then you have seen a good deal of Vane, and in case you have any hankering after his scalp, I think I'd better mention that there's reason to believe he won't be worth powder and shot before very long." "Ah," said Jessie, with a calmness which was difficult to assume, "you may as well understand that there is nothing between Vane and me. I suppose you mean that Howitson and Bendel are turning against him?" "Something like that," Horsfield agreed in a tone which implied that her answer had afforded him relief. "The man has trouble in front of him." Jessie changed the subject. What she had gathered from Mrs. Bendel was fully confirmed, but she had made up her mind. Evelyn's lover might wait for the warning which could save him, but he should wait in vain. End of chapter 25. Recording by Roger Melin. Chapter 26 of The Protector by Harold Bindloss. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Melin. The Protector by Harold Bindloss. Chapter 26. On the Trail. It was a long, wet sail up the coast with the wind ahead, and Carroll was content when, on reaching Comox, Vane announced his intention of stopping there until the mail came in. Immediately after its arrival, Carroll went ashore and came back empty-handed. "Nothing," he said. "Personally, I'm pleased. Nairn could have advised us here if there had been any striking developments since we left the last place." "I wasn't expecting to hear from him," Vane replied. Carroll read keen disappointment in his face, and was not surprised, although the absence of any message meant that it was safe for them to go on with their project, which should have afforded his companion satisfaction. They got off shortly afterwards and stood out to the northwards. Most of that day and the next two they drifted with the tides through narrowing waters, though now and then for a few hours they were wafted on by light and fickle winds. At length they crept into the inlet where they had landed on the previous voyage, and on the morning after their arrival set out on the march. There was on this occasion reason to expect more rigorous weather, and the load each carried was an almost crushing one. Where the trees were thinner, the ground was frozen hard, and even in the densest bush the undergrowth was white and stiff with frost, while, when they could see aloft through some chance opening, a forbidding gray sky hung over them. On approaching the rift in the hillside which he had glanced at when they first passed that way, Vane stopped a moment. "I looked into that place before, but it didn't seem worth while to follow it up," he said. "If you'll wait, I'll go a little farther along it." Though the air was nipping, Carroll, who was breathless, was content to remain where he was, and he spent some time sitting upon a log before a faint shout reached him. Then he rose, and making his way up the hollow, found his comrade standing upon a jutting ledge. "I thought you were never coming," the latter remarked. "Climb up, I've something to show you." Carroll joined him with difficulty, and Vane stretched out his hand. "Look yonder," he said. Carroll looked and started. They stood in a rocky gateway with the river brawling down the chasm beneath them, but a valley opened up in front. Filled with somber forest, it ran back almost straight between stupendous walls of hills. "It answers Hartley's description," he said. "After all, I don't think it's extraordinary we should have taken so much trouble to push on past the right place." "How's that?" Vane demanded. Carroll sat down and filled his pipe. "It's the natural result of possessing a temperament like yours. Somehow you've got it firmly fixed into your mind that everything worth doing must be hard." "I've generally found it so." "I think," said Carroll, grinning, "you've generally made it so. There's a marked difference between the two. If any means of doing a thing looks easy, you at once conclude it can't be the right way, which is a mode of reasoning that has never convinced me. In my opinion, it's more sensible to try the easiest method first." "As a rule, that leads to your having to fall back upon the other one, and a frontal attack on a difficulty's often quicker than considering how you can work round its flank. In this case, I'll own we have wasted a lot of time and taken a good deal of trouble that might have been avoided. But are you going to sit here and smoke?" "Until I've finished my pipe," Carroll answered. "I expect we'll find tobacco, among other things, getting pretty scarce before this expedition ends." He carried out his intention, and they afterwards pushed on up the valley during the rest of the day. It grew more level as they proceeded, and in spite of the frost, which bound the feeding snows, there was a steady flow of water down the river, which was free from rocky barriers. Vane, who now and then glanced at the latter attentively, stopped when dusk was drawing near, and fixed his gaze on the long ranks of trees that stretched away in front of him. Fretted spires of somber greenery lifted high above a colonnade of mighty trunks. "Does anything in connection with this bush strike you?" he asked. "Its stiffness, if that's what you mean," Carroll suggested, smiling. "These big conifers look as if they'd been carved. They're impressive, in a way, but they're too artificial." "That's not what I mean," Vane informed him impatiently. "To tell the truth," said Carroll, "I didn't suppose it was. Anyway, these trees aren't spruce. They're red cedar, the stuff they make the roofing shingles of." "Precisely. Just now shingles are in good demand in the province, and with the wooden towns springing up on the prairie, Western millers can hardly send roofing materials across the Rockies fast enough. Besides this, I haven't struck a creek more adapted for running logs down, and the last sharp drop to tidewater would give power for a mill. I'm only puzzled that none of the timber lease prospectors has recorded the place." "That's easy to understand," said Carroll. "Like you, they'd no doubt first search the most difficult spots to get at." They went on in another minute, and pitched their light tent beside the creek when darkness fell. "By the by, I thought you were disappointed when you got no mail at Comox," Carroll remarked at length, feeling that he was making something of a venture. "I was," said Vane. This was not encouraging, but Carroll persisted. "That's strange, because your hearing nothing from Nairn left you free to go ahead, which one would suppose was what you wanted." Vane, as it happened, was in a confidential mood. Though usually averse from sharing his troubles, he felt he needed sympathy. "I'd better confess, I wrote Miss Chisholm a few lines from Nanaimo." "Ah," said Carroll softly, "and she didn't answer you. Now I couldn't well help noticing that you were rather in her bad graces that night at Nairn's. No doubt you're acquainted with the reason?" "I'm not," Vane replied. "That's just the trouble." Carroll reflected. He had an idea that Miss Horsfield was somehow connected with the matter, but this was a suspicion he could not mention. "Well," he said, "as I pointed out, you're addicted to taking the hardest way. When we came up here before, you marched past this valley, chiefly because it was close at hand. But I don't want to dwell on that. Has it occurred to you that you did something of the same kind when you were at the Deane? The way that was then offered you was easy." "This is not the kind of subject one cares to talk about, but you ought to know I couldn't allow them to force Miss Chisholm upon me against her will. It was unthinkable. Besides, looking at it in the most cold-blooded manner, it would have been foolishness, for which we'd both have to pay afterwards." "I'm not so sure of that," said Carroll thoughtfully. "There were the Sabine women among other instances. Didn't they cut off their hair to make bowstrings for their abductors?" His companion made no answer, and Carroll, deciding that he had ventured as far as was prudent, talked of something else until they crept into the little tent, and soon afterwards they fell asleep. They started with the first of the daylight next morning, but the timber grew denser and more choked with underbrush as they proceeded, and for several days they wearily struggled through it and the clogging masses of tangled, withered fern. Besides this, they were forced to clamber over fallen trunks when the ragged ends of the snapped-off branches caught their loads. Their shoulders ached, their boots were ripped, their feet were badly galled, but they held on stubbornly, plunging deeper into the mountains all the while. Soon after setting out one morning, they climbed a clearer hillside to look about them. High up ahead, the crest of the White Range gleamed dazzlingly against leaden cloud in a burst of sunshine. Below, dark forest, still wrapped in gloom, filled all the valley, and in between, on the middle slopes, a belt of timber touched by the light shone with a curious silvery luster. Though it was some distance off, probably a day's journey, allowing for the difficulty of the march, Vane gazed at it earnestly. The trees were bare, there was no doubt of that, for the dwindling ranks, diminished by the distance, stood out against the snow-streaked rock like rows of rather thick needles set upright. Their straightness, and the way they glistened, suggested the resemblance. "Ominous, isn't it?" Carroll said at length. "If this is the valley Hartley came down, and everything points to that, we should be getting near the spruce." Vane's eyes grew set. "Yes," he agreed. "There has been a big fire up yonder, but whether it has swept the lower ground or not is more than I can tell. We'll find out early tomorrow." End of chapter 26. Recording by Roger Melin. Chapter 27 of The Protector by Harold Bindloss. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Melin. The Protector by Harold Bindloss. Chapter 27. The End of the Search. The two men made a hurried breakfast in the cold dawn, and not long afterwards they were struggling through thick timber, when the light suddenly grew a little clearer. Carroll remarked upon the fact, and Vane's face hardened. "We're either coming to a swamp, or the track the fire has swept is close in front," the latter said. A thicket lay before him, but he smashed savagely through the midst of it, the undergrowth snapping and crackling about his limbs. Then there was a network of tangled branches to be crossed, and afterwards, reaching slightly clearer ground, he broke into a run. 3 or 4 minutes later he stopped, breathless and ragged, with his rent boots scarcely clinging to his feet, and Carroll, who came up with him, gazed eagerly about. The living forest rose behind them, an almost unbroken wall, but ahead the trees ran up in detached and blackened spires. Their branches had vanished. Every cluster of somber green needles and delicate spray had gone. The great rampikes, as they were called, looked like shafts of charcoal. About their feet lay crumbling masses of calcined wood, which grew more and more numerous where there were open spaces farther on, and then the bare, black columns ran on again, up the valley and the steep hill benches on either hand. It was a weird scene of desolation, impressive to the point of being appalling in its suggestiveness of widespread ruin. For the space of a minute the men gazed at it, and then Vane, stretching out his hand, pointed to a snow-sheeted hill. "That's the peak Hartley mentioned," he said in a voice which was strangely incisive. "Give me the axe." He took it from his comrade and, striding forward, attacked the nearest rampike. Twice the keen blade sank noiselessly overhead, scattering a black dust in the frosty air, and then there was a clear, ringing thud. After that Vane smote on with a determined, methodical swiftness until Carroll grabbed his shoulder. "Look out!" he cried. "It's going!" Vane stepped back a few paces. The trunk reeled and rushed downwards. There was a deafening crash, and they were enveloped in a cloud of gritty dust. Through the midst of it they dimly saw two more great trunks collapse, and then somewhere up the valley a series of thundering shocks, which both knew were not echoes, broke out. The sound jarred upon Carroll's nerves, as the thud of the felled rampike had not done, but Vane picked up one of the chips and handed it to him. "We have found Hartley spruce," he said. Carroll did not answer for a minute. After all, when defeat must be faced, there was very little to be said, though his companion's expression troubled him. Its grim stolidity was portentous. "I suppose," he remarked at length, "nothing could be done with it?" Vane pointed to the butt of the tree, which showed a space of clean wood surrounded by a blackened rim. "You can't make marketable pulp of charcoal, and the price would have to run pretty high before it would pay for ripping most of the log away to get at the residue," he answered harshly. "But there may be some unburned spruce farther on," Carroll urged. "It's possible," said Vane. "I'm going to find out." This was a logical determination, but in spite of his recent suggestion, Carroll realized that he would have abandoned the search there and then, had the choice been left to him, in which he did not think he was singular. After all they had undergone, the shock of the disappointment was severe. He could have faced a failure to locate the spruce with some degree of philosophical calm, but to find it at last useless was very much worse. But he did not expect his companion to turn back yet. Before he desisted, Vane would seek for and examine every unburned tree. What was more, Carroll, who thought the search could serve no purpose, would have to accompany him. Then the latter noticed that Vane was waiting for him to speak, and he decided that this was a situation which he had better endeavor to treat lightly. "I think I'll have a smoke," he said. "I'm afraid any remarks I could make wouldn't do justice to the occasion. Language has its limits." He sat down on the charred log and took out his pipe before he proceeded. "A brûlée's not a nice place to wander about in when there's any wind, and I've an idea there's some coming, though it's quiet now." Shut in as they were in the deep hollow with the towering snows above them, it was impressively still, and in conjunction with the sight of the black desolation the deep silence reacted upon Carroll's nerves. He longed to escape from it, to make a noise, though this, if done unguardedly, might bring more of the rampikes thundering down. He could hear tiny flakes of charcoal falling from them, and though the fire had long gone out, a faint and curious crackling, as if the dead embers were stirring. He wondered if this were some effect of the frost. It struck him as disturbing and weird. "We'll work right around the brûlée," said Vane. "Then I suppose we had better head back for Vancouver, though we'll look at that cedar as we go down. Something might be made of it. I'm not sure we've thrown our time away." "You wouldn't be sure of such a thing," said Carroll. "It isn't in you." Vane disregarded this. A new constructive policy was already springing up out of the wreck of his previous plans. "There's a good mill site on the inlet, but as it's a long way from the railroad, we'll have to determine whether it would be cheaper to tow the logs down or split them up on the spot," he went on. "I'll talk it over with Drayton. He'll no doubt be useful, and there's no reason why he shouldn't earn his share." "Do you believe the arrangement you made with Hartley applies to the cedar?" "Of course," said Vane. "I don't know that the other parties could insist upon the original terms. We can discuss that later. But, though it may be modified, the arrangement stands." His companion considered the matter dispassionately, as an abstract proposition. Here was a man who, in return for certain information respecting the whereabouts of a marketable commodity, had undertaken to find and share it with his informant. The commodity had proved to be valueless, but during the search for it he had incidentally discovered something else. Was he under any obligation to share the latter with his informant's heirs? Carroll decided that the question could only be answered in the negative, but he had no intention of disputing his comrade's point of view. In the first place, this would probably only make Vane more determined or ruffle his temper, and in the second, Carroll, who felt very dubious about the prospect of working the cedar profitably, was neither a covetous nor an ambitious person, which was perhaps, on the whole, fortunate for him. Vane, as his partner realized, was ambitious, but in place of aspiring after wealth or social prominence, the latter of which had indeed of late began to pall on him, his was a different aim: to rend the hidden minerals from the hills, to turn forests into dressed lumber, to make something grow. Dollars are often, though not always, made that way. But while he affected no contempt for them, in Vane's case their acquisition was undoubtedly not the end. Fortunately, he was not altogether singular in this respect. When he next spoke, there was, however, no hint of altruistic sentiment in his curt inquiry. "Are you going to sit there until you freeze?" Carroll got up, and they spent the rest of the day plodding through the brûlée, with the result that when darkness fell, Vane had abandoned all idea of working the spruce. Next morning they set out for the inlet, and one afternoon during the journey they came upon several fallen logs lying athwart each other, with their branches spread in a horrible tangle between. Vane proceeded to walk along one log, which was tilted up several yards above the ground, balancing himself carefully upon the rounded surface, and Carroll followed until the end of a broken branch, which he evidently had not noticed, caught in the leader's clothes. Next moment there was a sharp snapping, and Vane plunged down into the tangle beneath, while Carroll stood still and laughed. It was not an uncommon accident. Vane, however, did not reappear, nor was there any movement among the half-rotten boughs and withered sprays, and Carroll, moving forward hastily, looked down into the hole. He was disagreeably surprised to see his comrade lying, rather white in face, upon his side. "I'm afraid you'll have to chop me out," he said, and his voice was hoarse. "Get to work. I can't move my leg." Moving farther along the log, Carroll dropped to the ground, which was less encumbered there, and spent the next quarter of an hour hewing a passage to his comrade. Then, as he stood beside him, hot and panting, Vane looked up. "It's my lower leg, the left," he said. "Bone's broken. I felt it snap." Carroll turned from him for a moment in consternation. Looking out between the branches, he could see the lonely hills tower, pitilessly white, against the blue of the frosty sky, and the rigid firs running back as far as his vision reached upon their lower slopes. There was no touch of life in all the picture. Everything was silent and motionless, and its desolation came near to appalling him. When he looked round again, Vane smiled wryly. "If this had happened farther north, it would have been the end of me," he said. "As it is, it's awkward." The word struck Carroll as singularly inadequate, but he made an effort to gather his courage when his companion broke off with a groan of pain. "It's lucky we helped that doctor when he set Pete's leg at Bryant's mill," he said. "Can you wait a few minutes?" Vane's face was beaded with damp now, but he tried to smile. "It strikes me," he answered, "I'll have to wait a mighty long time." Carroll turned and left him. He was afraid to stand still and think, but action was a relief. It was some time before he returned with several strips of fabric cut from the tent curtain, and the neatest splints he could extemporize from slabs of stripped-off bark, and the next half-hour was a trying one to both of them. Sometimes Vane assisted him with suggestions, once he reviled his clumsiness, and sometimes he lay silent with his face awry and his lips tight-set. But at length it was done, and Carroll stood up, breathing hard. "I'll fasten you on to a couple of skids and pull you out," he said. "Then I'll make camp." He managed it with difficulty, pitched the tent above Vane, whom he covered with their blankets, and made a fire outside. "Are you comfortable now?" he inquired. Vane looked up at him with a somewhat ghastly grin. "I suppose I'm about as comfortable as could be expected. Anyhow, I've got to get used to the thing. 6 weeks is the shortest limit, isn't it?" Carroll confessed that he did not know, and presently Vane resumed, "It's lucky that the winters aren't often very cold so near the coast." The temperature struck Carroll as low enough, but he made no answer. To his disgust, he could think of no cheering observation, for there was no doubt that the situation was serious. They were cut off from the sloop by leagues of tangled forest, which a vigorous man would find it difficult to traverse, and it would be weeks before Vane could use his leg. No human assistance could be looked for, and they had only a small quantity of provisions left. Besides this, it would not be easy to keep the sufferer warm in rigorous weather. "I'll make supper. You'll feel better afterwards," he said at length. "Then don't be too liberal," Vane warned him. The latter fell into a restless doze after the meal, and it was dark when he opened his eyes again. "I can't sleep any more, and we may as well talk. There are things to be arranged," he said. "In the first place, as soon as I feel a little easier, you'll have to sail across to Comox and hire some men to pack me out. When you've sent them off, you'll make for Vancouver and get a timber license and find out how matters are going on." "That," said Carroll firmly, "is out of the question. Nairn can look after our mining interests. He's a capable man, and if the thing's too much for him they can go to smash. Besides, they won't give you a timber license without full particulars of area and limits, and we've blazed no boundaries. Anyhow, I'm staying right here." Vane began to protest, but Carroll raised his hand. "Argument's not conducive to recovery. You're on your back, unfortunately, and I'll give way to you, as usual, as soon as you're on your feet again, but not before." "I'd better point out that we'll both be hungry by then. The provisions won't last long." "Then I'll look for a deer as soon as I think you can be left. And now we'll try to talk of something more amusing." "Can you see anything humorous in the situation?" "I can't," Carroll confessed. Still, there may be something of that description which I haven't noticed yet. By the way, the last time we were at Nairn's, I happened to cross the room near where you and Miss Horsfield were sitting, and I heard her ask you to wait for something at Nanaimo or Comox. I thought it curious." "She told me to wait, so she could send me word to come back, if it was needful." "Ah," said Carroll. "I won't ask why she was willing to do so. It concerns you more than me. But I fancy that, as regards your interests in the Clermont, a warning from her would be worth as much as one from Nairn. That is, if she could be depended on." "Have you any doubt upon the subject?" "Don't get angry. Perhaps I've talked too much. We have to think of your injury." "I'm not likely to forget it," Vane informed him. "But I dare say you're right in one respect. As an amusing companion you're a dead failure, and talking isn't as easy as I imagined." He lay silent afterwards, and, though he had disclaimed any desire for sleep, worn by the march and pain as he was, his eyes presently closed. Carroll, however, sat long awake, and afterwards admitted that he felt badly afraid. Deer are by no means numerous in some parts of the bush. They had not seen one during the journey, and though there was a little food left on board her, it was a long way to the sloop. Once or twice, for no obvious reason, he drew aside the tent flap and looked out. The sky was cloudless and darkly blue, and a sickle moon gleamed in it, keen and clear with frost. Below, the hills were washed in silver, majestic, but utterly cheerless. And lower still, the serrated tops of the rigid firs cut against the dreary whiteness. After each glimpse of them, Carroll drew his blanket tighter round him with a shiver. Very shortly, when the little flour and pork were gone, and their few cartridges had been expended, he would be reduced to the condition of primitive man. Cut off from all other resources, he must then wrest what means of subsistence he could from the snowy wilderness by brute strength and cunning, and such instruments as he could make with his unassisted hands, except that an axe of Pennsylvania steel was better than a stone one. Civilization has its compensations, and Carroll longed for a few more of them that night. On rising next morning, he found the frost keener, and he spent the day, and a number of those that followed, in growing anxiety, which was only temporarily lessened when he once succeeded in killing a deer. There was almost a dearth of animal life in the lonely valley. Sometimes, at first, Vane was feverish. Often he was irritable, and the recollection of the 3 or 4 weeks he spent with him afterwards haunted Carroll like a nightmare. At last, when he had spent several days in vain search for a deer and the provisions were almost exhausted, he and his companion held a council of emergency. "There's no use in arguing," Vane declared. "You'll rig me a shelter of green boughs outside the tent, and close to the fire. I can move from the waist upwards, and, if it's necessary, drag myself with my hands. Then you can chop enough cordwood to last a while, cook my share of the eatables, and leave me while you go down to the sloop. There's half a bag of flour and a few other things I'd be uncommonly glad of on board her." Carroll expostulated, but it was evident that his companion was right, and next morning he started for the inlet, taking with him the smallest possible portion of their provisions. So long as he had enough to keep him from fainting on the way, it was all he required, because he could renew his stores on board the boat. The weather broke during the march, driving snow followed him down the valley, and by gave place to bitter rain. The withered underbrush was saturated, the soil was soddened with melting snow, and after the first scanty meal or two he dare risk no delay. He felt himself flagging from insufficient food, and it was obvious that he must reach the sloop before he broke down. He had tobacco, but that failed to stay the gnawing pains, and before the march was done he was on the verge of exhaustion, forcing himself onward, drenched and grim of face, scarcely able to keep upon his bleeding feet. It was falling dusk and blowing fresh when he limped down the beach and with a last effort launched the light dinghy and pulled off to the sloop. She rode rather deep in the water, but that did not trouble him. Most wooden craft leak more or less, and it was a considerable time since he had pumped her out. Clambering wearily on board, he made the dinghy fast and then stood still a moment or two, looking about him with his hand on the cabin side. Thin flakes of snow drifted past him, the firs were rustling eerily ashore, and ragged wisps of cloud drove by low down above their tops. Little frothy ripples flecked the darkening water with streaks of white and splashed angrily against the bows of the craft. The prospect was oppressively dreary, and the worn-out man was glad that he was at last in shelter and could snatch a few hours' rest. Thrusting back the slide, he stepped below and lighted the lamp. The brightening glow showed him that the boat's starboard side was wet high up, and though there was a good deal of water in her, this puzzled him, until an explanation suggested itself. They had moored the craft carefully, but he supposed she must have dragged her anchor or kedge and swung in near enough the shore to ground towards low tide. Then, as the tide left her, she would fall over on her starboard bilge, because they had lashed the heavy boom down on that side, and the water in her would cover the depressed portion of her interior. This reasoning was probably correct, but he did not foresee the result until, after lighting the stove and putting on the kettle, he opened the provision locker, which was to starboard. Then he saw, with a shock of dismay, that the stock of food they had counted on was ruined. The periodically submerged flour bag had rotted and burst, and most of its contents had run out into the water as the boat righted with the rising tide. The prepared cereals, purchased to save cooking, had turned to moldy pulp, and the few other stores were in much the same condition. There were only 2 sound cans of beef, and a few ounces of unspoiled tea in a canister. Carroll's courage failed him as he realized it, but he felt that he must eat and sleep before he could grapple with the situation. He would allow himself a meal and a few hours' rest, and crawling out while the kettle boiled, he shortened in the cable and plied the pump. Then he went below and feasted on preserved beef and tea, gauging the size of each slice with anxious care until he reluctantly laid the can aside. After that he filled his pipe, and stretching out his aching limbs on the port locker, which was comparatively dry, soon sank into heavy sleep. End of chapter 27. Recording by Roger Melin. Chapter 28 of The Protector by Harold Bindloss. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Melin. The Protector by Harold Bindloss. Chapter 28. Carroll Seeks Help. Carroll slept for several hours before he awakened and sat up on the locker, shivering. He had left the hatch slightly open, and a confused uproar reached him from outside, the wail of wind-tossed trees, the furious splash of ripples against the bows, and the drumming of the halyards upon the mast. There was no doubt that it was blowing hard, but the wind was off the land and the sloop in shelter. Filling his pipe, he set himself to think, and promptly decided that it would have been better had he gone down to the sloop in the beginning, before the provisions had been spoiled, instead of in the end. Reluctance to leave his helpless companion had mainly prevented him from doing this, but he had also been encouraged by the possibility of obtaining a deer now and then. It was clear that he had made a mistake in remaining, but it was not the first time he had done so, and the point was unimportant. The burning question was, what must he do now? It would obviously be useless to go back with rations that would barely suffice for the march. Vane still had food enough to keep life in one man for a little while. On the other hand, it would not be a long sail to Comox with a strong northerly wind, and if the sloop would face the sea that was running, he might return with assistance before his comrade's scanty store was exhausted. Getting out the mildewed chart, he laid off his course, carefully trimmed and lighted the binnacle lamp, and going up on deck, hauled in the kedge anchor. He could not break the main one out, though he worked savagely with a tackle, and, deciding to slip it, he managed to lash 3 reefs in the mainsail and hoist it with the peak left down. Then he sat down to gather breath, for the work had been cruelly heavy, before he let the cable run and hoisted the jib. She paid off when he put up his helm, and the black loom of trees ashore vanished. He thought he could find his way out of the inlet, but he only knew that he had done so when the angry ripples that splashed about the boat suddenly changed to confused tumbling combers. They foamed up in swift succession on her quarter, but he fancied she would withstand their onslaught, so long as he could prevent her from screwing up to windward when she lifted. It would need constant care, and if he failed, the next comber would, no doubt, break on board. His task was one that would have taxed the vigilance of a strong, well-fed man, and Carroll had already nearly reached the limit of his powers. His case, however, was by no means an unusual one. The cost of the subjugation of the wilderness is the endurance of hunger and thirst, cold and crushing fatigue, and somebody pays to the uttermost farthing. Carroll, sitting drenched, strung up, and hungry, at the helm, was merely playing his part in the struggle, though he found it cruelly hard. It was pitch dark, but he must gaze ahead and guess the track of the pursuing seas by the angle of the spouting white ridge abreast of the weather shrouds. He had a compass, but when his course did not coincide with safety, it must be disregarded. The one essential thing was to keep the sloop on top, and to do so he had frequently to let her fall off dead before the mad white combers that leaped out of the dark. By and by his arms began to ache from the strain of the tiller, and his wet fingers grew stiff and claw-like. The nervous strain was also telling, but that could not be helped. He must keep the craft before the sea or go down with her. There was one consolation: she was traveling at a furious speed. At length morning broke over a leaden sea that was seamed with white, and he glanced longer at the meat can on the locker near his feet. He could reach it by stooping, though he dare not leave the helm, but he determined to wait until noon before he broke his fast again. It could not be very far to Comox, but the wind might drop. Then he began to wonder how he had escaped the perils of the night. He had come down what was really a wide and not quite straight sound passing several unlighted islands. Before starting, he had decided that he would run so long and then change his course a point or two, but he could not be sure that he had done so. He had a hazy recollection of seeing surf, and once a faint loom of land, but he supposed he had avoided it half-consciously, or that chance had favored him. In the afternoon the wind changed a little, backing to the northwest, the sky grew brighter, and he made out shadowy land over his starboard quarter. By and by he recognized it with a start. It was the high ridge north of Comox, and as he had run farther than he had expected, he must try to hoist the peak of the mainsail and haul her on the wind. There was danger in rounding her up, but it must be faced, though a sea foamed across her as he put down his helm. Another followed, but he scrambled forward and struggled desperately to hoist the down-hanging gaff. The halyards were swollen. He could scarcely keep his footing on the deluged deck that slanted steeply under him. He thought he could have mastered the banging canvas had he been fresh, but, worn out as he was, drenched with spray, and buffeted by the shattered tops of the seas, the task was beyond his power. Giving it up, he staggered back, breathless and almost nerveless, to the helm. He could not reach Comox, which lay to windward, with the sail half set, but it was only 70 miles or thereabouts to Nanaimo, and not very much farther to Vancouver. The breeze would be fair to either, and he could charter a launch or tug for the return journey. Letting her go before the sea again, he ate some canned meat ravenously, tearing it with one hand. Shortly afterwards a gray mass rose out of the water to port, and he supposed it was Texada. There were mines on the island, and he might be able to engage a rescue party, but he reflected that he could not beat the sloop back to windward unless the breeze fell, which it showed no signs of doing. It would be more prudent to go on to Vancouver, where he would be sure of getting a steamer, but he closed with the Long Island a little, and dusk was falling when he made out a boat in the partial shelter of a bight. Standing in closer, he saw that there were 2 men in the craft, and driving down upon her he backed the jib and ran alongside. There was a crash as he struck the boat, and an astonished and angry man clutched the sloop's rail. "Now what in the name of thunder—" he began, and stopped, struck by Carroll's ragged appearance. "Can you take this sloop to Vancouver?" the latter inquired. "I could if it was worth while," was the cautious answer. "It will be a mighty wet run." $7 a day, until you're home again," said Carroll. "A bonus if you can sail her with the whole reefed mainsail up. I won't stick at a few dollars. Can your partner pull that boat ashore alone? If not, cast her adrift. I'll buy her." "He'll make the beach," said the other, jumping on board. $7 sounds a square deal. I won't put the screw on you." "Then help me hoist the peak," Carroll bade him. "After that you can take the helm. I'm played out." The man, who shouted something to his companion, seized the halyards, and the sloop drove on again furiously, with an increased spread of canvas, while Carroll stood holding on by the coaming while the boat dropped back. "I'll leave you to it," he informed the new helmsman. "It's 24 hours since I've had more than a bite or two of food, and some weeks since I had a decent meal." "You look like it," the other informed him. "Been up against it somewhere?" Carroll, who did not reply, crawled below and managed to light the stove and make a kettleful of tea. He drank a good deal of it, and nearly emptied the remaining small meat can, which he presently held out for his companion's inspection, standing beneath the hatch. "There's some tea left, but this is all there is to eat on board the craft," he said. "You're hired to take her to Vancouver, and you'd better get there as soon as you can." The bronzed helmsman nodded. "She won't be long on the way if the mast holds up." "Have you seen any papers lately?" Carroll inquired. "I've been up in the bush, and I'm interested in the Clermont mine. It looked as if there might be some changes in the company's prospects when I went away." "I noticed a bit about it in the Colonist a while back," was the answer. "They sold out to another concern, or amalgamated with it, I don't remember which." Carroll was not astonished. The news, which implied that he must be prepared to face a more or less serious financial reserve, struck him as a fitting climax to his misadventures. "It's pretty much what I expected, and I'm going to sleep," he said. "I don't want to be wakened before it's necessary." He crawled below, and he had hardly stretched himself out upon the locker before his eyes closed. When he opened them, feeling more like his usual self, he saw that the sun was above the horizon, and recognized by the boat's motion that the wind had fallen. Going out, he found her driving through the water under her whole mainsail and the helmsman sitting stolidly at the tiller. The man stretched out a hand and pointed to the hazy hills to port. "We'll fetch the Narrows some time before noon," he said. "If you'll take the helm, I guess we'll have that meat for breakfast." His prediction proved correct, for Carroll reached his hotel about midday, and hastily changing his clothes, set off to call on Nairn. He had not recovered his mental equipoise, and in spite of his long, sound sleep, he was still badly jaded physically. On arriving at the house, he was shown into a room where Mrs. Nairn and her husband were sitting with Evelyn, waiting for the midday meal. The elder lady rose with a start of astonishment when he walked in. "Man," she said, "what's wrong? You're looking like a ghost." It was not an inapt description. Carroll's face was worn and haggard, and his clothes hung slack on him. "I've been feeling rather unsubstantial of late, as the result of a restricted diet," he answered with a smile, and sat down in the nearest chair, while Nairn regarded him with carefully suppressed curiosity. "You're ower lang in coming," he remarked. "Where did you leave your partner?" Carroll sat silent a moment or two, his eyes fixed on Evelyn. It was evident that his sudden appearance unaccompanied by Vane, which he felt had been undesirably dramatic, had alarmed her. At first he felt compassionate, and then he was suddenly possessed by hot indignation. This girl, with her narrow prudish notions and cold-blooded nature, had presumed to condemn his comrade, unheard, for an imaginary offense. The thing was at once ludicrous and intolerable. If his news brought her dismay, let her suffer. His nerves, it must be remembered, were not in their normal condition. "Yes," he said in answer to his host's first remark, "I've gathered that we have failed to save the situation. But I don't know exactly what has happened. You had better tell me." Mrs. Nairn made a sign of protest, but her husband glanced at her restrainingly. "You will hear his news in good time," he informed her, and turned to Carroll. "In a few words, the capital was not subscribed. It leaked out that the ore was running poor, and we held an emergency meeting. With Vane away, I could put no confidence into the shareholders. They were anxious to get from under, and Horsfield brought forward an amalgamation scheme. His friends would take the property over on their valuation. I and a few others were outvoted. The scheme went through, and when the announcement steadied the stock, which had been tumbling down, I exercised the authority given me, and sold your shares and Vane's at considerably less than their face value. You can have particulars later. What I have to ask now is, where is Vane?" The man's voice grew sharp. The question was flung out like an accusation, but Carroll still looked at Evelyn. He felt very bitter against her. "I left him in the bush with no more than a few days' provisions and a broken leg," he said. Then, in spite of Evelyn's efforts to retain her composure, her face blanched, and Carroll's anger vanished, because the truth was clear. Vane had triumphed through disaster. His peril and ruin had swept his offenses away. The girl, who had condemned him in his prosperity, would not turn away from him in misfortune. In the meanwhile, the others sat silent, gazing at the bearer of evil news, until he spoke again. "I want a tug to take me back at once, if she can be got," he said. "I'll pick up a few men along the waterfront." Nairn rose and went out of the room. The tinkle of a telephone bell reached those who remained, and he came back a minute or two later. "I've sent Whitney round," he announced. "He'll come across if there's a boat to be had, and now you looks as if you needed lunch." "It's several weeks since I had one," said Carroll with a smile. The meal was brought in, but for a while he talked as well as ate, relating his adventures in somewhat disjointed fragments, while the rest sat listening. He was also pleased to notice something which suggested returning confidence in him in Evelyn's intent eyes as the tale proceeded. When at last he had made the matter clear, he added, "If I keep you waiting, you'll excuse me." His hostess watched his subsequent efforts with candid approval, and, looking up once or twice, he saw sympathy in the girl's face, instead of the astonishment or disgust he had half expected. When he had finished, his hostess rose and Carroll stood up, but Nairn signed to him to resume his place. "I'm thinking you'd better sit down a while and smoke," he said. Carroll was glad to do so, and he and Nairn conferred together, until the latter was called to the telephone. "You can have the Broderick boat at noon tomorrow," he said on his return. "That won't do," Carroll objected heavily. "Send Whitney round again. I must sail tonight." He had some difficulty in getting out the words, and when he rose his eyes were half closed. Walking unsteadily, he crossed the room and sank into a big lounge. "I think," he resumed, "if you don't mind, I'll go to sleep." Nairn merely nodded, and when, after sitting silent a minute or two, he went softly out, the worn-out man was already wrapped in profound slumber. As it happened, Nairn received another call by telephone, and left in haste for his office, without speaking to his wife, with the result that the latter and Evelyn, returning to the room by and by in search of Carroll, found him lying still. The elder lady raised her hand in warning as she bent over the sleeper, and then, taking up a light rug, spread it gently over him. Evelyn, too, was stirred to sudden pity, for the man's attitude was eloquent of exhaustion. They withdrew gently, and had reached the corridor when Mrs. Nairn turned to the girl. "When he first came in, you blamed that man for deserting his partner," she said. Evelyn confessed it, and her hostess smiled meaningly. "Are you not rather ready to blame?" "I'm afraid I am," said Evelyn, with the color creeping into her face, as she remembered an instance in which she had condemned another person hastily. "In this case," said her companion, "you were very foolish. The man came down for help, and if he could not get it, he would go back his loan. If all the way was barred with ice, he must walk on his naked feet. Love of woman strong, and the fear of death is keen, but you will find now and then a faith between man and man that neither would sever. She paused and looked at the girl fixedly as she asked, "What of him that could inspire it?" Evelyn did not answer. She had never seen her hostess in this mood, and she was also stirred. But the elder lady went on again, "The virtue of a gift lies in part, but not altogether, with the giver. Whiles it may be bestowed unworthily, but I'm thinking it's not often. The bond that will drag Carroll back to the North again, to his death if it is needful, has not been spun from nothing." Evelyn had no doubt that Mrs. Nairn was right. Loyalty, most often, demanded a worthy object to tender service to. It sprang from implicit confidence, mutual respect, and strong appreciation. It was not without a reason Vane had inspired it in his comrade's breast, and this was the man she had condemned. The latter fact, however, was by comparison a very minor trouble. Vane was lying helpless and alone in the snowy wilderness, in peril of his life, and she knew that she loved him. She realized now, when it might be too late, that had he in reality been stained with dishonor, she could have forgiven him. Indeed, it had only been by a painful effort she had maintained some show of composure since Carroll had brought the disastrous news, and she felt she could not keep it up much longer. What she said to Mrs. Nairn she could not remember, but escaping from her, she retired to her own room, to lie still and grapple with an agony of fear and contrition. It was 2 hours later when she went down and found Carroll, who still looked drowsy, about to go out. His hostess had left him for a moment in the hall, and, meeting the girl's eyes, he smiled at her reassuringly. "Don't be anxious, I'll bring him back," he said. Then Mrs. Nairn appeared, and in a few moments Carroll went out, without another word to Evelyn. She did not ask herself why he had taken it for granted that she would be anxious. She was beyond any petty regard for appearances. It was consoling to remember that he was Vane's tried comrade, one of the men who kept their word. End of chapter 28. Recording by Roger Melin. Chapter 29 of The Protector by Harold Bindloss. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Melin. The Protector by Harold Bindloss. Chapter 29. Jessie's Contrition. After leaving Mrs. Nairn, Carroll walked towards Horsfield's residence in a thoughtful mood, because he felt it incumbent upon him to play a part he was not particularly fitted for in a somewhat delicate matter. Uncongenial as his task was, it was one which could not be left to Vane, who was even less to be trusted with the handling of such affairs, and Carroll had resolved, as he would have described it, to straighten out things. His partner had somehow offended Evelyn, and though she was now disposed to forgive him, the recollection of his supposititious iniquity might afterwards rankle in her mind. Though Vane was innocent of any conduct she could with reason take exception to, it was first of all needful to ascertain the exact nature of the charge against him. Carroll, who had for several reasons preferred not to press this question upon Evelyn, had a strong suspicion that Jessie Horsfield was at the bottom of the trouble. There was also a clue to follow. Vane had paid the rent of Celia Hartley's shack, and he wondered if Jessie could by any means have heard of it. If she had done so, the matter would be simplified, because he had a profound distrust of her. A recent action of hers was, he thought, sufficient to justify this attitude. He found her at home, reclining gracefully in an easy-chair in her drawing-room, and though she did not seem astonished to see him, He fancied her expression hinted at suppressed concern. "I heard you had arrived alone, and I intended to come over and make inquiries as soon as I thought Mrs. Nairn would be at liberty," she informed him. Carroll had found the direct attack effective in Evelyn's case, and he determined to try it again. "Then," he began, "it says a good deal for your courage." He had never doubted that she possessed the latter quality, and she displayed it now. "So," she said calmly, "you have come as an enemy." "Not exactly. It didn't seem worth while. Though there's no doubt you betrayed us, Vane waited for the warning you could have sent. So far as it concerns our ruined interests in the Clermont, the thing's done and can't be mended. We'll let that question go. The most important point is that if you had recalled us, as you promised, Vane would now be safe and sound." This shot told. The girl's face became less imperturbable. There was eagerness and a suggestion of fear in it. "Then has any accident happened to him?" she asked sharply. "He's lying in the bush, helpless, in imminent peril of starvation." "Go on," said the girl, with signs of strain clearly perceptible in her voice. Carroll was brief, but he made her understand the position, after which she turned upon him imperiously. "Then why are you wasting your time here?" "It's a reasonable question. I can't get a tug to take me back until noon tomorrow." "Ah," said Jessie, and added, "You will excuse me for a minute." She left him astonished. He had not expected her to take him at a disadvantage, as she had done with her previous thrust, and now he did not think she had slipped away to hide her feelings. That did not seem necessary in Jessie's case, though he believed she was more or less disturbed. She came back presently, looking calm, and sat down again. "My brother will be here in a quarter of an hour," she informed him. "Things are rather slack, and he half promised to take me for a drive. I have called him up through the telephone." Carroll did not see how this bore upon the subject of their conversation, but he left her to take the lead. "Did Vane tell you I had promised to warn him?" she asked. "To do him justice, he let it out before he quite realized what he was saying. I'd better own that I partly surprised him into giving me the information." "The expedient seems a favorite one with you," said Jessie. "I suppose no news of what has happened here can have reached him?" "None. If it's any consolation, he has still an unshaken confidence in you," Carroll assured her with blunt bitterness. The girl showed faint signs of confusion, but she sat silent for the next few moments, and during them it flashed upon her companion with illuminating light that he had heard Celia Hartley say Miss Horsfield had found her orders for millinery. This confirmed his previous suspicion that Jessie had discovered who had paid the rent of Celia's shack, and that she had with deliberate malice informed Evelyn, distorting her account so that it would tell against Vane. There were breaks in the chain of reasoning which led him to this conclusion, but he did not think Jessie would shrink from such a course, and he determined to try a chance shot. "Vane's inclined to be trustful, and his rash generosity has once or twice got him into trouble," he remarked, and went on as if an explanation were needed. "It's Miss Hartley's case I'm thinking about just now. I've an idea he asked you to look after her. Am I right?" As soon as he had spoken, he knew he had hit the mark. Jessie did not openly betray herself, but there are not many people who can remain absolutely unmoved when unexpectedly asked a startling question. Besides, the man was observant, and had strung up all his faculties for the encounter. He saw one of her hands tighten on the arm of her chair, and a hint of uneasiness in her eyes, and it sufficed him. "Yes," she said. "I recommended her to some of my friends. I understand she is getting along satisfactorily." Carroll felt compelled to admire her manner. He believed she loved his comrade and had nevertheless tried to ruin him in a fit of jealous rage. She was now keenly regretting her success, but though he thought she deserved to suffer, she was bravely facing the trying situation. It was one that was rife with dramatic possibilities, and he was grateful to her for avoiding them. "You are going back tomorrow," she said after a brief silence. "I suppose you will have to tell your partner what you have discovered here as soon as you reach him?" Carroll had not intended to spare her, but now he felt almost compassionate, and he had one grain of comfort to offer. "I must tell him that his shares in the Clermont have been sacrificed. I wonder if that is all you meant?" Jessie met his inquiring gaze with something very like an appeal, and then spread out her hands in a manner to indicate that she threw herself upon his mercy. "It is not all I meant," she confessed. "Then if it's any relief to you, I'll confine myself to telling him that he has been deprived of his most valuable property. I dare say the news will hit him hard enough, but though he may afterwards discover other facts for himself, on the whole I shouldn't consider it likely. As I said, he's confiding and slow to suspect." He read genuine gratitude, which he had hardly expected, in the girl's face, but he raised his hand and went on in the rather formal manner which he felt was the only safe one to assume. "I had, however, better mention that I am going to call upon Miss Hartley. After that I shall be uncommonly thankful to start back for the bush." He paused, and concluded with a sudden trace of humor. "I'll own that I feel more at home with the work that waits me there." Jessie made a little gesture which, while it might have meant anything, was somehow very expressive, and just then there were footsteps outside. Next moment Horsfield walked into the room. "So you're back," he said. "Yes," said Carroll shortly. "Beaten at both ends. There's no use in hiding it." Horsfield showed no sign of satisfaction, and Carroll afterwards admitted that the man behaved very considerately. "Well," he said, "though you may be surprised to hear it, I'm sorry. Unfortunately, our interests clashed, and I naturally looked after mine. Once upon a time I thought I could have worked hand in hand with Vane, but our ideas did not coincide, and your partner is not the man to yield a point or listen to advice." Carroll was aware that Horsfield had by no means which were far from honorable deprived him of a considerable portion of his possessions. He had also betrayed his fellow shareholders in the Clermont mine, selling their interests, doubtless for some benefit to himself, to another company. For all that, Carroll recognized that since he and Vane were beaten, as he had confessed, recriminations and reproaches would be useless as well as undignified. He preferred to face defeat calmly. "It's the fortune of war," he replied. "What you say about Vane is correct, but although it is not a matter of much importance now, it was impossible from the beginning that your views and his ever should agree." "Too great a difference of temperament? I dare say you're right. Vane measures things by a different standard. Mine's perhaps more adapted to the marketplace. But where have you left him?" "In the bush. Miss Horsfield will, no doubt, give you particulars. I've just told her the tale." "She called me up at the office and asked me to come across at once. Will you excuse us for a few minutes?" They went out together, and Jessie, who came back alone, sat down and looked at Carroll in a different manner. "I suppose," she said, "one could hardly expect you to think of either of us very leniently, but I must ask you to believe that I am sincerely distressed to hear of your partner's accident. This was a thing I could never have anticipated, but there are amends I can make. Every minute you can save is precious, isn't it?" Carroll agreed, and she resumed, "Then I can get you a tug. My brother tells me the Atlin's coming across from Victoria, and should be here early this evening. He has gone back to the office to secure her for you, though she was fixed to go off for a log boom." "Thank you," said Carroll. "It's a great service." Jessie hesitated. "I think my brother would like to say a few words when he returns. Can I offer you some tea?" "I think not," said Carroll, smiling. "For one thing, if I sit still much longer, I shall no doubt go to sleep again, as I did at Nairn's, which would be neither seemly nor convenient, if I'm to sail this evening. Besides, now we've arranged an armistice, I might be wiser not to put too much strain on it." "An armistice?" "I think that describes it." Carroll's manner grew significant. "The word implies a cessation of hostilities, on certain terms." Jessie could take a hint, and his meaning was clear. Unless she forced him to do so, he would not betray her to his comrade, who might never discover the part she had played. But he had given her a warning, which might be bluntly rendered as "hands off." There was only one person open to her, to respect it. She had brought down the man she loved, but it was clear that he was not for her. And now the unreasoning fury which had driven her to strike had passed, she was troubled with contrition. There was nothing left except to retire from the field, and it was better to do so gracefully. For all that, there were signs of strain in her expression as she capitulated. "Well," she said, "I have given you a proof that you have nothing to fear from me. My brother is the only man in Vancouver who could have got you that tug for this evening. I understand the sawmill people are very much in need of the logs she was engaged to tow." She held out her hand, and Carroll took it, though he had not expected to part from her on friendly terms. "I owe you a deal for that," he said, and turned away. His task, however, was only half complete when he left the house, and the remaining portion was the more difficult, but he meant to finish it. He preferred to take life lightly. He had trifled with it before disaster had driven him out into the wilds, but there was resolution in the man, and he could force himself to play an unpleasant part when it was needful. Fortune also favored him, as she often does those who follow the boldest course. He had entered Hastings Street when he met Kitty and Celia. The latter looked thin and somewhat pale, but she was moving briskly, and her face was eager when she shook hands with him. "We have been anxious about you. There was no news," she said. "Is Mr. Vane with you? How have you got on?" "We've found the spruce," said Carroll. "It's not worth milling. A forest fire has wiped most of it out, but we struck some shingling cedar we may make something of." "But where's Mr. Vane?" "In the bush. I've a good deal to tell you about him, but we can't talk here. I wonder if we could find a quiet place in a restaurant, or if the park would be better." "The park," said Kitty, decidedly. They reached it in due time, and Carroll, who had refused to say anything about Vane on the way, found the girls a seat in a grove of giant firs, and sat down opposite to them. Though it was winter, the day, as is often the case near Vancouver, was pleasantly mild. "Now," he began, "my partner is a singularly unfortunate person. In the first place, the transfer of the Claremont property, which you have no doubt heard of, means a serious loss to him, though he is not ruined yet. He talks of putting up a shingling mill, in which Drayton will be of service, and if things turn out satisfactory you will be given an interest in it." He added the last sentence as an experiment, and was satisfied with the result. "Never mind our interests," cried Kitty. "What about Mr. Vane?" For the third time since his arrival, Carroll made the strongest appeal he could to womanly pity, drawing with a purpose a vivid picture of his comrade's peril and suffering. Nor was he disappointed, for he saw consternation, compassion, and sympathy in the girls' faces. So far the thing had been easy, but now he hesitated, and it was with difficulty he nerved himself for what must follow. "He has been beaten out of his stock in the mine. He's broken down in health and in danger. But, by comparison, that doesn't count for very much with him," he continued. "He has another trouble, and though I'm afraid I'm giving things away in mentioning it, if it could be got over, it would help him to face the future and set him on his feet again." Then he briefly recounted the story of Vane's regard for Evelyn, making the most of his sacrifice in withdrawing from the field, and again he realized that he had acted wisely. A love affair appealed to his listeners, and there was a romance in this one that heightened the effect of it. "But Miss Chisholm can't mean to turn from him now," said Celia. Carroll looked at her meaningly. "No, she turned from him before he sailed. She heard something about him." His companions appeared astonished. "But she couldn't have heard anything that anybody could mind," Kitty exclaimed indignantly. "He's not that kind of man." "It's a compliment," said Carroll. "I think he deserves it. At the same time, he's a little rash, and now and then a man's generosity is open to misconception. In this case, I don't think one could altogether blame Miss Chisholm." Kitty glanced at him sharply, and then at Celia, who at first looked puzzled and afterward startled. Then the blood surged into Kitty's cheeks. "Oh," she said, as if she were breathless, "I was once afraid of something like this. You mean we're the cause of it?" The course he followed was hateful to Carroll, but the tangle could not be straightened without somebody's feelings being hurt, and it was his comrade he was most concerned about. "Yes," he said quietly, "I believe you understand the situation." He saw the fire in Kitty's eyes, and that Celia's face was also flushed, but he did not think their anger was directed against him. They knew the world they lived in, and, for that matter, he could share their indignation. He resented the fact that a little thing should bring such swift suspicion upon them. He was, however, not required to face any disconcerting climax. "Well," said Celia, "why did you tell us this?" "I think you both owe Vane something, and you can do him a great favor now," Carroll informed her. Kitty looked up at him. "Don't ask me too much, Mr. Carroll. I'm Irish, and I feel like killing somebody." "It's natural," said Carroll with a sympathetic smile. "I've now and then felt much the same thing. It's probably unavoidable in a world like this. However, I think you ought to call upon Miss Chisholm after I've gone, though you had better not mention that I sent you. You can say you came for news of Vane, and add anything you consider necessary." The girls looked at one another, and at length, though it obviously cost her a struggle, Kitty said to Celia firmly, "We will have to go." Then she faced round towards Carroll. "If Miss Chisholm won't believe us, she'll be sorry we came." Carroll made her a slight inclination. She'll deserve it if she's not convinced. But it might be better if you didn't approach her in the mood you're in just now." Kitty rose, signing to Celia, and he turned back with them towards the city, feeling a certain constraint in their company and yet conscious of a strong relief. It had grown dark when he returned to Nairn's house. "Where have you been?" his host inquired. "I had a clerk seeking you all around the city. I cannot get you a boat before the morn." Carroll saw that Mrs. Nairn shared her husband's desire to learn how he had been occupied. Evelyn was also in the room. "There were one or two little matters that required attention, and I managed to arrange them satisfactorily," he said. "Among other things, I've got a tug, and I expect to sail in an hour or two. Miss Horsfield found me the vessel." He noticed Evelyn's interest, and was rather pleased to see it. If she were disposed to be jealous of Jessie, it could do no harm. Nairn, however, frowned. "I'm thinking it might have been better if you had not troubled Jessie," he commented. "I'm sorry, I can't agree with you," Carroll retorted. "The difference between this evening and noon tomorrow is a big consideration." "Well," said Nairn resignedly, "I cannot deny that." Carroll changed the subject, but some time later Mrs. Nairn sat down near him in the temporary absence of her husband and Evelyn. "We will not be disturbed for 2 or 3 minutes," she said. "You answered Alec like a Scotsman before supper, and put him off the track, though that's not so easy done. You're too complimentary," he declared. "The genuine Caledonian caution can't be acquired by outsiders. It's a gift." "I'll not practice it now," said the lady. "You're not so proud of yourself for nothing. What have you been after?" Carroll crossed his fingertips and looked at her over them. "Since you ask the question, I may say this. If Miss Chisholm has 2 lady visitors during the next few days, you might make sure she sees them." "What are their names?" "Miss Hartley, the daughter of the prospector who sent Vane off to look for the timber, Miss Blake, who, as you have probably heard, once came down the west coast with him, in company with an elderly lady and myself." Mrs. Nairn started. Then she looked thoughtful, and finally broke into a smile of open appreciation. "Now," she said, "I understand. I did not think it of you. You're not far from a genius." "Thanks," said Carroll modestly. "I believe I succeeded better than I could have expected, and perhaps than I deserved." Then they were interrupted, for Nairn walked hastily into the room. "There's one of the Atlin's deckhands below," he announced. "He's come on here from Horsfield's to say the boat's ready with a full head of steam up, and the packers you hired are waiting on the wharf." Carroll rose and became in a moment intent and eager. "Tell him I'll be down almost as soon as he is," he said. "You'll have to excuse me." 2 minutes later he left the house, and fervent good wishes followed him from the party on the stoop. He did not stop to acknowledge them, but shortly afterwards the blast of a whistle came ringing across the roofs from beside the waterfront. End of chapter 29. Recording by Roger Melin. Chapter 30 of The Protector by Harold Bindloss. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Melin. The Protector by Harold Bindloss. Chapter 30. Convincing Testimony. One afternoon, 3 or 4 days after Carroll had sailed, Evelyn sat alone in Mrs. Nairn's drawing room, a prey to confused regrets and keen anxiety. She had recovered from the first shock caused by Carroll's news, but though she could face the situation more calmly, she could find no comfort anywhere. Vane was lying helpless and famishing in the frost-bound wilderness. She knew she loved the man. Indeed, she had really known it for some time, and it was that which had made Jessie's revelation so bitter. Now, fastidious in thought and feeling as she was, she wondered if she had been too hard upon him. It was becoming more and more difficult to believe that he could have justified her disgust and anger, but this was not what troubled her most. She had sent him away with cold disfavor. He was threatened by many dangers. It was horrible to think of what might befall him before assistance arrived, and yet she could not drive the haunting dread out of her mind. She was in this mood when a maid announced that 2 visitors wished to see her, and when they were shown in, she found it difficult to hide her astonishment as she recognized in Kitty the very attractive girl she had once seen in Vane's company. It was this which prompted her to assume a chilling manner, though she asked her guests to be seated. Neither of them appeared altogether at her ease, and there was, indeed, a rather ominous sparkle in Kitty's blue eyes. The latter began the conversation. "Mr. Carroll was in town not long ago," she said. "Have you had any news of him since he sailed?" Evelyn did not know what to make of the question, and she answered coldly, "No, we do not expect any word for some time." "I'm sorry," said Kitty. "We're anxious about Mr. Vane." On the surface the announcement appeared significant, but the girl's boldness in coming to her for news was unexplainable to Evelyn. Puzzled as she was, her attitude became more discouraging. "You know him, then?" she said. Something in her tone made Celia's cheeks burn, and she drew herself up. "Yes," she said, "we know him, both of us. I guess it's astonishing to you, but I met him first when he was poor, and getting rich hasn't spoiled Mr. Vane." Evelyn was once more puzzled. The girl's manner savored less of assurance than of wholesome pride which had been injured. Kitty, however, broke in, "We had no cards to send in. But I'm Kathleen Blake, and this is Celia Hartley. It was her father sent Mr. Vane off to look for the spruce." "Ah," said Evelyn, a little more gently, addressing Celia. "I understand your father died." Kitty flashed a commanding glance at Celia, who spoke, "Yes, that is correct. He left me ill and worn out, without a dollar, and I don't know what I should have done if Mr. Vane hadn't insisted on giving Drayton a little money for me, on account, he said, because I was a partner in the venture. Then Miss Horsfield got me some work to do at home among her friends. Mr. Vane must have asked her to. It would be like him." Evelyn sat silent for a few moments. Celia had given her a good deal of information in answer to a very simple remark, but she was most impressed by the statement that Jessie, who had prejudiced her against Vane, had helped the girl at his request. It was difficult to believe she would have done so had there been any foundation for her insinuations. If Celia spoke the truth, and Evelyn somehow felt this was the case, the whole thing was extraordinary. "Now," said Celia, "it's no way surprising I'm grateful to Mr. Vane and anxious to hear if Mr. Carroll has reached him." This was spoken with a hint of defiance, but the girl's voice changed. "I am anxious. It's horrible to think of a man like him freezing in the bush." Her concern was so genuine and yet somehow so innocent that Evelyn's heart softened. "Yes," she said, "it's dreadful." Then she asked a question. "Who's the Mr. Drayton you mentioned?" Kitty blushed becomingly. This was her lead. "He's a kind of partner in the lumber scheme. I'm going to marry him. He's as firm a friend of Mr. Vane's as anyone. There's a reason for that. I was in a very tight place once, left without money in a desolate settlement where there was nothing I could do, when Mr. Vane helped me. But perhaps that wouldn't interest you." For a moment her doubts still clung to their hold in Evelyn's mind, and then she suddenly drove the last of them out, with a stinging sense of humiliation. She could not distrust this girl. It was Jessie's suggestion that was incredible. "It would interest me very much," she said. Kitty told her story effectively, but with caution, laying most stress upon Vane's compassion for the child and her invalid mother. She was rather impressed by Miss Chisholm, but she supposed the latter was endowed with some of the failings common to human nature. Evelyn listened to her with confused emotions and a softened face. She was convinced of the truth of the simple tale, and the thought of Vane's keeping his moneyed friends and directors waiting in Vancouver, in order that a tired child might rest and gather shells upon a sunny beach, stirred her deeply. It was so characteristic, exactly what she would have expected him to do. "Thank you," she said quietly, when Kitty had finished. And then, flinging off the last of her reserve, she asked a number of questions about Drayton and Celia's affairs. Before her visitors left, all three were on friendly terms, but Evelyn was glad when they took their departure. She wanted to be alone to think, though, in spite of the relief she was conscious of, her thoughts were far from pleasant, and foremost among them figured a crushing sense of shame. She had wickedly misjudged a man who had given her many proofs of the fineness of his character. The evil she had imputed to him was born of her own perverted imagination. She was no better than the narrow-minded, conventional Pharisees she detested, who were swift to condemn out of the uncleanliness of their self-righteous hearts. Then, as she began to reason, it flashed upon her that she was, perhaps, wronging herself. Her mind had been cunningly poisoned by an utterly unscrupulous and wholly detestable woman, and she flamed out into a fit of imperious anger against Jessie. She had a hazy idea that this was not altogether reasonable, since she was to some extent fastening the blame she deserved upon another person. But it did not detract from the comfort the indulgence in her indignation brought her. When she had grown calmer, Mrs. Nairn came in, and Mrs. Nairn was a discerning lady. It was not difficult to lead Evelyn on to speak of her visitors, for the girl's pride was broken, and she felt in urgent need of sympathy. But when she had described the interview, she felt impelled to avoid any discussion of its more important issues. "I was surprised at the girl's manner," she concluded. "It must have been embarrassing to them, but they were really so delicate over it, and they had so much courage." Mrs. Nairn smiled. "Although one has travelled with third-rate strolling companies, and the other has waited in a hotel? Well, maybe your surprise was natural. You cannot all at once get rid of the ideas and prejudices you were brought up with." "I suppose that was it," said Evelyn thoughtfully. Her companion's eyes twinkled. "Then if you're to live among us happily, you'll have to try. In the way you use the words, some of the leading men in this country were not brought up at all." "Do you imagine that I'm going to live here?" Mrs. Nairn gathered up one or two articles she had brought into the room with her, and moved towards the door, but before she reached it she looked back at the girl. "It occurred to me that the thing was not altogether impossible," she said. An hour afterwards, Evelyn went down into the town with her, and in one of the streets they came upon Jessie leaving a store. The latter was not lacking in assurance, and she moved forward to meet them, but Evelyn gazed at her with a total disregard of her presence and walked quietly on. There was neither anger nor disdain in her attitude. To have shown either would have been a concession she could not make. The instincts of generations of gently reared Englishwomen were aroused, as well as the revulsion of an untainted nature from something unclean. Jessie's cheeks turned crimson, and a malevolent light flashed into her eyes as she crossed the street. Mrs. Nairn noticed her expression and smiled at her companion. "I'm thinking it's as well you met Jessie after she had got the boat for Carroll," she said. The remark was no doubt justified, but the fact that Jessie had been able to offer valuable assistance failed to soften Evelyn towards her. It was merely another offence. In the meanwhile, the tug had steamed northwards, towing the sloop which would be required, and, after landing the rescue party at the inlet, steamed away again. Before she had disappeared, Carroll began his march, and his companions long remembered it. Two of them were accustomed to packing surveyors' stores through the seldom-trodden bush, and the others had worked in logging camps and chopped new roads. But though they did not spare themselves, they lacked their leader's stimulus. Carroll, with all his love of ease, could rise to meet an emergency, and he wore out his companions before the journey was half done. He scarcely let them sleep. He fed them on canned stuff to save delay in lighting fires, and he grew more feverishly impatient with every mile they made. He showed it chiefly by the tight set of his lips and the tension in his face, though now and then, when fallen branches or thickets barred the way, he fell upon the obstacles with the axe in silent fury. For the rest, he took the lead and kept it, and the others, following with shoulders aching from the back straps and labored breath, suppressed their protests. Like many another made in that country, it was a heroic journey, one in which mind and body were taxed to the limit. Delay might prove fatal. The loads were heavy. Fatigue seized the shrinking flesh, but the unrelenting will, trained in such adventures, mercilessly spurred it on. Toughened muscle is useful, and in the trackless north can seldom be dispensed with. But man's strength does not consist of that alone. There are occasions when the stalwart fall behind and die. In front of them, as they progressed, lay the unchanging forest, tangled, choked with fallen wreckage, laced here and there with stabbing thorns, appalling and almost impenetrable to the stranger. They must cleave their passage, except where they could take to the creek for an easier way and wade through stingingly cold water or flounder over slippery fangs of rocks and ice-encrusted stones. There was sharp frost among the ranges, and the brush they broke through was generally burdened with clogging snow. They went on, however, and on the last day Carroll drew away from those who followed him. It was dark when he discovered that he had lost them, but that did not matter, for now and then faint moonlight came filtering down, and he was leaving a plain trail behind. His shoulders were bleeding beneath the biting straps. He was on the verge of exhaustion, but he struggled forward, panting heavily, and rending his garments to rags as he smashed through the breaks in the darkness. The night, it seemed a very long one, was nearly over, when he recognized the roar of a rapid that rang in louder and louder pulsations across the snow-sprinkled bush. He was not far from the end now, and he became conscious of an unnerving fear. The ground was ascending sharply, and when he reached the top of the slope, the question he shrank from would be answered for him. If there was no blink of light among the serried trunks, he would have come too late. He reached the summit, and his heart jumped. Then he clutched at a drooping branch to support himself, shaken by a reaction that sprang from relief. A flicker of uncertain radiance fell upon the trees ahead, and down the bitter wind there came the reek of pungent smoke. After that, for the bush was slightly more open, Carroll believed he ran, and presently came crashing and stumbling into the light of the fire. Then he stopped, too stirred and out of breath to speak, for Vane lay where the red glow fell upon his face, smiling up at him. "Well," he said, "you've come. I've been expecting you, but on the whole I got along not so badly." Carroll flung off his pack and sat down beside the fire. Then he fumbled for his pipe and began to fill it hurriedly with trembling fingers. "Sorry I couldn't get through sooner," he explained. "The stores on board the sloop were spoiled. I had to go on to Vancouver. But there are things to eat in my pack." "Hand it across," said Vane. "I haven't been faring sumptuously the last few days. No, sit still. I'm supple enough from the waist up." He proved it by the way he leaned to and fro as he opened the pack and distributed part of its contents among the cooking utensils, while Carroll, who assisted now and then, did not care to speak. The sight of the man's gaunt face, and the eagerness in his eyes, prompted him to an outbreak of feeling which was rather foreign to his nature, and which he did not think Vane would appreciate. When the meal was ready, the latter looked up at him. "I've no doubt this journey cost you something, partner," he said. Then they ate cheerfully, and Carroll, who watched his friend's efforts with appreciation, told his story in broken sentences, sometimes with his mouth rather full, for he had not troubled about much cooking since he left the inlet. Afterwards they lighted their pipes, but by and by Carroll's fell from his relaxing grasp. "I can't get over this sleepiness," he explained. "I believe I disgraced myself in Vancouver by going off in the most unsuitable places." "I dare say it was natural," said Vane with some dryness. "Anyway, hadn't you better hitch yourself a little farther from the fire?" Carroll did so, and lay still afterwards, but Vane kept watch during the rest of the night, until in the dawn the packers appeared. End of chapter 30. Recording by Roger Melin. Chapter 31 of The Protector by Harold Bindloss. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Melin. The Protector by Harold Bindloss. Chapter 31. Vane is Reinstated. Breakfast was over, and the two men, wrapped in blankets, lay on opposite sides of the fire. Now that they had a supply of provisions, haste was not a matter of importance, and the rescue party needed a rest. Carroll was aching all over his body, and somewhat disturbed in mind, because he had not said anything about their financial affairs to his comrade yet, and the subject must be mentioned. "What about the Clermont?" Vane asked at length. "You needn't trouble about breaking the news. Come right to the point." "Then to all intents and purposes the company has gone under. It's been taken over by Horsfield's friends. Nairn has sold our stock, at considerably less than its face value," and Carroll added a brief account of the absorption of the concern. "Ah," said Vane, whose face set hard, I anticipated something of the kind last night. I saw how you kept clear of the matter." "But you said nothing." "No," said Vane. "I'd had time to consider the thing while I lay here, and it didn't look as if I could have got an intelligible account out of you. But you may as well mention how much Nairn got for the shares." He lay smoking silently for a few minutes after Carroll told him, and the latter was strongly moved to sympathy, since he thought it was not his financial reverse, but one indirect result of it which would hit his comrade hardest. "Well," said Vane grimly, "I suppose I've done what my friends would consider a mad thing in coming up here, and I must face the reckoning." Carroll wondered if their conversation could be confined to the surface of the subject, because there were depths it would be better to leave undisturbed. "After all, you're far from broke," he said as cheerfully as he could. "You have what the Clermont stock brought in, and you may make something out of this shingle-splitting scheme." There was bitterness in Vane's laugh. "When I left Vancouver for England, I was generally supposed to be well on the way to affluence, and there was some foundation for the idea. I had floated the Clermont in the face of opposition. People believed in me. I could have raised what dollars I required for any new undertaking. Now a good deal of my money and my prestige is gone. Folks have very little confidence in a man who has shown himself a failure. Besides, I may be a cripple." Carroll could guess his companion's thoughts. There was a vein of stubborn pride in him, and he had, no doubt, decided it was unfitting that Evelyn's future should be linked to that of a ruined man. This was an exaggerated view, because Vane was in reality far from ruined, and even if he had been so, he had in him the ability to recover from his misfortunes. Still, the man was obstinate and generally ready to make a sacrifice for an idea. Carroll, however, consoled himself with the reflection that Evelyn would probably have something to say upon the subject, if she were given an opportunity, and he thought Mrs. Nairn would contrive that she had one. "I can't see any benefit in making things out as considerably worse than they are," he said. "Nor can I," Vane agreed. "After all, I was getting pretty tired of the city, and I suppose I can raise enough to put up a small power mill. It will be a pleasant change to take charge for a year or so in the bush. I'll make a start at the thing as soon as I'm able to walk." This was significant, because it implied that he did not intend to remain in Vancouver, where he would have been able to enjoy Evelyn's company. But Carroll made no comment, and by Vane spoke again. "Didn't you mention last night that it was through Miss Horsfield you got the tug?" he asked. "I was thinking about something else at the time." "Yes," said Carroll. "She made Horsfield put some pressure on the people who had previously hired the boat." "Ah," said Vane. "That's rather strange." For a moment he looked puzzled, but almost immediately his face grew impassive, and Carroll knew that he had some idea of Jessie's treachery. He was, however, sure that any suspicions his comrade entertained would remain locked up in his breast. "I'm grateful to her, anyway," the latter resumed. "I believe I could have held out another day or two, but it wouldn't have been pleasant." Carroll began to talk about the preparations for their return, which he soon afterwards set about making, and early next morning they started for the sloop, carrying Vane upon a stretcher they had brought. Though they had to cut a passage for it every here and there, they reached the vessel safely, and after some trouble in getting him below and onto a locker, Carroll decided to sail straight for Vancouver. They were favored with moderate fair winds, and though the boat was uncomfortably crowded, she made a quick passage and stole in through the Narrows as dusk was closing down one tranquil evening. As it happened, Evelyn had spent part of the afternoon on the forest-crested rise above the city, up which new dwellings were then creeping, though they have, no doubt, spread beyond it and back into the bush by now. From there she could look down upon the inlet, and she had visited the spot frequently during the last few days, watching eagerly for a sail that did not appear. There had been no news of Carroll since the skipper of the tug reported having landed him, and the girl was tormented by doubts and anxieties. She had just come back, and was standing in Mrs. Nairn's sitting room when she heard the tinkle of the telephone bell. A moment or two later her hostess entered hastily. "It's a message from Alec," she cried. "He's heard from the wharf. Vane's sloop's crossing the harbor. I'll away down to see Carroll brings him here." Evelyn turned to follow her, but Mrs. Nairn waved her back. "No," she said firmly, "you'll bide where you are. See they get plenty lights on, at the stairhead and in the passage, and the room on the left of it ready." She was gone in another moment, and Evelyn, who carried out her instructions, afterwards waited with what patience she could assume. At last there was a rattle of wheels outside, followed by a voice giving orders, and then a tramp of feet. The sounds brought her a strange inward shrinking, but she ran to the door and saw two tattered men awkwardly carrying a stretcher up the steps, while Carroll and another assisted them. Then the light fell upon its burden, and half prepared as she was, she started in dismay. Vane, whom she had last seen in vigorous health, lay partly covered with an old blanket which had slipped off him to the waist, and his jacket looked a mass of rags. His hat had fallen aside, and his face showed hollow and worn and pinched. Then he saw her, and a light sprang into his eyes, but next moment Carroll's shoulder hid him, and the men plodded on towards the stairs. They ascended them with difficulty, and the girl waited until Carroll came down. "I noticed you at the door, and I expect you were a little shocked at the change in Vane," he said. "What he has undergone has pulled him down, but if you had seen him when I first found him, you'd have been worse startled. He's getting on quite satisfactorily." Evelyn was relieved to hear it, but Carroll, who had paused, continued, "As soon as the doctor comes, we'll make him more presentable. But as I'm not sure about the last bandages I put on, he can't be moved till then. Afterwards he'll no doubt hold an audience." There was nothing to do but wait, and Evelyn again summoned her patience. Before long a doctor arrived, and Carroll followed him to Vane's room alone. The latter's face was very impassive, though Carroll waited in tense suspense while the doctor stripped off the bandages and bark supports from the injured leg. He examined it attentively, and then looked round at Carroll. "You fixed that limb when it was broken in the bush?" he said. "Yes," said Carroll, with a desperate attempt to treat the matter humorously. "But I really think we both had a hand in the thing. My partner favored me with his views. I disclaim some of the responsibility." "Then I guess you've been remarkably fortunate, which is perhaps the best way of expressing it." Vane raised his head and fixed his eyes upon the speaker. "It won't have to be rebroken? I'll be able to walk without a limp?" "I should say the latter's very probable." Vane's eyes glistened and he let his head fall back. "It's good news, better than I expected. Now, if you could fix me up again, I'd like to get dressed. I've felt like a hobo long enough." The doctor nodded indulgently. "We can venture to change that state of affairs, but I'll superintend the operation." It was some time before Vane's toilet was completed, and then Carroll surveyed him with humorous admiration. "You do us credit, and now I suppose I can announce that you'll receive?" he said. Nairn and his wife and Evelyn came in, and the former, who shook hands with Vane very heartily, afterwards looked down at him with twinkling eyes. "I'd have been glad to see ye, however ye had come," he said, and Vane fully believed him. "For all that, this is not the way I could have wished to welcome ye." "When a man won't take his friend's advice, what can he expect?" said Vane. "Let it be a warning. If the making of your mark and dollars is your object, you must stick to it and think of nothing else. You cannot accumulate riches by spreading yourself, and philanthropy's no lucrative, except maybe to a few." "It's good counsel, but I'm thinking that's a pity," his wife remarked. "What would you say, Evelyn?" The girl was aware that the tone of light banter had been adopted to cover deeper feelings, which those present shrank from expressing, but she ventured to give her thoughts free rein. "I agree with you in one respect," she said, "but I can't believe that the object mentioned is Mr. Vane's only one. He would never be willing to pay the necessary price." It was a delicate compliment, uttered in all sincerity, and Vane's worn face grew warm. He was, however, conscious that it would be safer to avoid being serious, and he smiled. "Well," he said, "looking for timber rights is apt to prove expensive, too. I had a haunting fear I might be lame, until the doctor banished it. I'd better own that I'd no great confidence in Carroll's surgery." Carroll, keeping strictly to the line the others had chosen, made him an ironical bow, but Evelyn was not to be deterred. "It was foolish of you to be troubled," she declared. "It isn't a fault to be wounded in an honorable fight, and even if the mark remains, there is no reason why one should be ashamed of it." Mrs. Nairn glanced at the girl rather sharply, but Carroll came to his comrade's assistance. "Strictly speaking, there wasn't a wound," he pointed out. "Fortunately, it was what is known as a simple fracture. If it had been anything else, I'm inclined to think I could have treated it." Nairn chuckled, as if this met with his approval, but his wife turned round and they heard a patter of footsteps on the stairs. "Yon bell has kept on ringing since we came up," she said. "I left word I was not to be disturbed. Well," as the door opened, "what is it, Minnie?" "The reception room's plumb full," announced the maid, who was lately from the bush. "If any more folks come along, I won't know where to put them." Now the door was open, Evelyn could hear a murmur of voices on the floor below, and next moment the bell rang violently again, which struck her as a testimonial to the injured man. Vane had not spent a long time in Vancouver, but he had the gift of making friends. Having heard of the sloop's arrival, they had come to inquire for him, and there was obviously a number of them. Mrs. Nairn glanced interrogatively at Carroll. "It does not look as if they could be got rid of by a message." "I guess he's fit to see them," Carroll answered. "We'll hold the levee. If he'd only let me, I'd like to pose him a bit." Mrs. Nairn, with Evelyn's assistance, did so instead, rearranging the cushions about the man, in spite of his confused and half-indignant protests, and during the next half-hour the room was generally full. People walked in, made sympathetic inquiries, or exchanged cheerful banter, until Mrs. Nairn forcibly dismissed the last of them. After this she declared that Vane must go to sleep, and paying no heed to his assertion that he had not the least wish to do so, she led her remaining companions away. A couple of hours had passed when she handed Evelyn a large tumbler containing a preparation of whipped-up eggs and milk. "You might take him this, and ask if he would like anything else," she said. "I'm weary of the stairs, and I would not trust Minnie. She's handiest at spilling things." "It's the third, and I'd better say firmly, the limit," Carroll remarked. Then he assumed an aggrieved expression as Evelyn moved off with a tray. "I can't see why I couldn't have gone. I believe I've discharged my duties as nurse satisfactorily." Evelyn shared his suspicions. Her hostess's artifice was a transparent one, but she nevertheless fell in with it. She had only seen Vane in the company of others. This might be the same again tomorrow, and there was something to be said. By intuition as much as reason, she knew that there was something working in his mind, something that troubled him and might trouble her. It excited her apprehension and animated her with a desire to combat it. That she might be compelled to follow an unconventional course did not matter. This man was hers, and she could not let him go. She entered his room collectedly. He was lying, neatly dressed, upon a couch, with his shoulders raised against the end of it, for he had thrown the cushions which had supported him upon the floor. As she came in, he leaned down in an attempt to recover them, and, finding himself too late, looked up guiltily. The fact that he could move with so much freedom was a comfort to the girl. She set down the tray on a table near him. "Mrs. Nairn has sent you this," she said, and the laugh they both indulged in drew them together. Then her mood changed, and her heart yearned over him. He had gone away a strong, self-confident, prosperous man, and he had come back defeated, broken in health and fortune and terribly worn. Her pity shone in her softening eyes. "Do you wish to sleep?" she asked. "No," Vane assured her. "I'd a good deal sooner talk to you." "Well," said Evelyn, "I have something to say. I'm afraid I was rather unpleasant to you the evening before you sailed. I was sorry for it afterwards. It was flagrant injustice." "Then I wonder why you didn't answer the letter I wrote at Nanaimo." "For a very good reason. I never got it." Vane considered this for a few moments. "After all," he said, "it doesn't matter now. I'm acquitted?" "Absolutely." "Do you know," he said, "I've still no idea of my offense?" Evelyn was exceedingly glad to hear it, but a warmth crept into her face, and as the blood showed through the delicate skin, he fixed his eyes intently upon her. "It was all a mistake. I'm sorry still," she declared penitently. "Oh," he said in a different tone, "I wouldn't trouble about it. The satisfaction of being acquitted outweighs everything else. Besides, I've made a number of rather serious mistakes myself. The search for that spruce, for instance, is supposed to be one." "No," said Evelyn decidedly. "Whoever thinks that is wrong. It is a very fine thing you have done. It doesn't matter in the least that you were unsuccessful." "You believe that?" "Of course. How could I believe anything else?" The man's face changed again, and once more she read the signs. Whatever doubts and half-formed resolutions, and she had some idea of them, had been working in his mind were dissipating. "Well," he said, "I've sacrificed the best of my possessions, and destroyed the confidence of folks who, to serve their ends, would have helped me on. Isn't that a serious thing?" "No. It's really a most unimportant one. I," and the slight pause gave the assertion force, "I really mean it." Vane partly raised himself with one arm, and there was no doubting the significance of his intent gaze. "I believe I made another blunder in England. I should have had more courage and have faced the risk. But you might have turned against me then." "I don't think that's likely," said Evelyn, lowering her eyes. The man leaned forward towards her, but the hand he stretched out fell short, and the trivial fact once more roused her compassion for his helplessness. "You can only mean one thing," he said. "You wouldn't be afraid to face the future with me now?" "I wouldn't be afraid at all," said Evelyn quietly. By and by Mrs. Nairn tapped at the door and smiled rather broadly when she came in. Then she shook her head in reproach. "You should have been asleep a while since," she said to Vane, and turned to Evelyn. "Is this the way you intend to look after him?" She waved the girl towards the door, and when she joined her in the passage, kissed her effusively. "You've got the man I would have chosen for you," she said. The End. End of chapter 31. Recording by Roger Melin. End of The Protector by Harold Bindloss.